In November 2017, the most expensive hotel in Saudi Arabia was turned into a prison. Not metaphorically, not as a political stunt designed for cameras. The Ritz-Carlton in Riyadh. 5 stars, gold fixtures, marble floors, the kind of place where a standard room runs $800 a night and where heads of state sleep in suites that cost more per evening than most people earn in a month, was cleared of its regular guests overnight. Security forces moved in. And then, over the course of 48 hours, the most powerful men in Saudi Arabia were brought in one by one and locked inside. Princes, ministers, generals, billionaires, men who had spent their entire adult lives sitting at the very center of Saudi power. Men who owned palaces and fleets of private jets and entire floors of London apartment buildings, and who had, until that week, believed with complete justification that they were untouchable. Men who had never waited for anything in their lives and who had never, in any serious sense, been told no by anyone. They were arrested at gunpoint. More than 200 of them, brought to the Ritz-Carlton and told to sit down and wait while the new power in Saudi Arabia, a 32-year-old crown prince named Mohammed bin Salman, known to the world as MBS, decided what to do with them. What followed over the next 3 months was one of the most audacious transfers of wealth in the history of the modern world. Detainees were presented with a simple offer: hand over a significant portion of your fortune, sign documents transferring assets, cooperate with the investigation into corruption, and you can leave. Refuse, and things become considerably more complicated. The amounts extracted from the men in the Ritz-Carlton, paid in cash, in real estate, in business stakes, in bank transfers to government accounts, totaled by the Saudi government's own accounting, more than $100 billion. $100 billion collected in 3 months from a hotel ballroom. The men who walked out of the Ritz-Carlton were richer than almost anyone on earth. The men who walked out were also, in many cases, significantly less rich than they had walked in. And the man who had put them there, who had looked at the most powerful network of wealth and influence in the kingdom and decided to dismantle it and reassemble it on terms that served his own vision of where Saudi Arabia needed to go. That man had just made the most dramatic statement about power and money, and the relationship between the two that anyone had made anywhere in the world in a very long time. To understand why this happened and how the men in that hotel had accumulated the kind of wealth that made it worth imprisoning them to get some of it back, you need to understand how Saudi money works. Not at the surface level, not the obvious story of oil and petrodollars that everyone already knows in broad outline. You need to understand it at the level of the specific, particular operational reality of how a small group of families in one of the most closed societies on earth became, over the course of 3 generations, among the most fabulously wealthy people in human history. And you need to understand what they did with that wealth, what they built, what they bought, where they went, how they lived, in ways that the Saudi system of secrecy and the general opacity of Gulf finance have kept largely invisible to the outside world. That story starts with sand. In 1938, the Arabian Peninsula was almost entirely empty of the things that create modern wealth. There were no factories, no railroads, no banks in the Western sense, no stock markets, no professional class, no industrial infrastructure of any kind. There was the Hejaz on the Red Sea coast, with its holy cities of Mecca and Medina and its long tradition of commerce built on the pilgrimage trade. There was the Najd in the interior, dry, austere, the homeland of the Wahhabi religious tradition that the Al Saud family had adopted as its ideological foundation. There was fishing on the Gulf Coast, and pearl diving in the warm, shallow waters of Bahrain and Kuwait, and the strip of coastline that would eventually become the Eastern Province. And, underneath all of it, in quantities that no one had yet imagined, because no one had yet looked properly, there was oil. In March 1938, a team of American geologists working for the California Arabian Standard Oil Company, SASOC, which would eventually become Aramco and then Saudi Aramco, the most valuable company on earth, struck oil in commercial quantities at a well called Dammam No. 7. The well produced in abundance. More wells were drilled. Each one confirmed what the geology had suggested. The eastern province of Arabia was sitting on top of the largest conventional oil reservoir ever discovered, a field so enormous in its extent and so rich in its concentration that the men who measured it had to check their calculations multiple times because the numbers seemed impossible. King Abdulaziz ibn Saud, the founder of modern Saudi Arabia, received the news in the way that a man receives information that he understands immediately will change everything about his world and is not entirely sure he wants everything about his world changed. He was a practical man, Abdulaziz, a man who had united the peninsula through decades of warfare and political maneuvering, and who governed what he had built with the specific combination of tribal authority and religious legitimacy that was the only available governance technology in the Arabia of his time. He understood that the oil money was necessary. He was not entirely comfortable with the foreigners who would be needed to extract it. He made the deal anyway because he was smart enough to understand that the alternative, letting the oil stay in the ground while his kingdom remained poor, was not, in the long run, a viable option. The deal he made with Cassock and the subsequent arrangements with what became Aramco were the foundation of everything that followed. American companies extracted the oil. The Saudi government received royalties and eventually, as the post-war global order shifted and the logic of resource nationalism spread through the developing world, an increasing share of the revenues. By 1973, the year of the first oil embargo, Saudi Arabia was receiving payments large enough to fundamentally alter the government's relationship to its own population and to the wider world. By 1980, the year oil prices reached their first great peak, Saudi Arabia was receiving oil revenues that made the concept of national budget essentially meaningless, because the money coming in so far exceeded the cost of running the country that the excess had nowhere obvious to go. It was invested. It was distributed in the specific ways that a monarchy distributes resources through a network of princes and officials and trusted families who manage the relationship between the national wealth and the various functions of the state. It was, in more cases than official accounts acknowledged, diverted, taken by the people in a position to take it, through mechanisms that ranged from the formally sanctioned to the technically illegal but practically unprosecuted. The result, accumulated over 4 decades of oil revenues, was a concentration of private wealth at the top of Saudi society that had no real parallel anywhere in the world except possibly the Gulf states of Kuwait and the UAE. And because Saudi society was organized around a royal family that numbered, by the time of the Ritz-Carlton arrests, somewhere between 15,000 and 30,000 princes, each with varying degrees of access to the national treasury and the national favor, the distribution of this wealth was extraordinarily complex, extraordinarily opaque. Understanding who the Saudi billionaires actually are requires understanding how the Al Saud dynasty works, which requires understanding that it is not a single family in the normal sense. King Abdulaziz had, by various accounts, anywhere from 45 to 67 surviving sons by his many wives. The exact number is a matter of some scholarly dispute, but the scale of it is not. These sons, the first generation of princes, were the foundation of the modern Saudi establishment. They and their sons formed the network of Al Saud princes, who, as of the mid-2010s, held essentially every significant position of power and influence in the kingdom. The Defense Ministry, the Interior Ministry, the Intelligence Services, the governorships of the major provinces, the leadership of Saudi Aramco, the boards of the major state enterprises, all of it, all the way down, Al Saud. This created a system in which proximity to the center, to the king, to the key princes, to the men who controlled the budget allocations and the contract awards and the decisions about who got access to what, was the primary determinant of wealth. Not entrepreneurship in the Western sense. Not innovation or efficiency or the creation of genuine commercial value. Proximity. The ability to be present in the right room, to have the right relationships, to be trusted by the right people, and to translate that trust into the specific economic opportunities that the Saudi system made available to those inside the circle and withheld, absolutely and completely, from those outside it. This is the first thing to understand about Saudi billionaire wealth. Most of it, not all, but most of it, and certainly the largest concentrations, did not arise from the kind of commercial activity that Western business culture recognizes as wealth creation. It arose from access. From contracts for infrastructure projects, where the margin was spectacular, from positions in state enterprises where the salary was one component and the parallel streams of income were several others, from real estate transactions in which government-owned land was sold to connected individuals at prices that bore little relationship to market value and then developed or resold at prices that did, from import licenses and agency agreements and distribution monopolies, and the thousand other mechanisms by which a state that controls most of the significant economic activity in a country can, if it chooses, direct enormous wealth to individuals it favors. The men who built the largest fortunes in Saudi Arabia understood this system with the clarity of people who had grown up inside it. They were brilliant, many of them genuinely intellectually capable, genuinely entrepreneurial in the sense of seeing opportunities in moving quickly and building organizations that could execute on a large scale. The system rewarded intelligence and energy and political skill and organizational ability. It also rewarded, in many cases, nothing more than the accent of birth and the consequent advantage of knowing the right people before the money arrived. Prince Al-Walid bin Talal is the Saudi billionaire most familiar to the outside world, and his story illustrates both the possibilities and the limits of what the Saudi system could produce. He was born in 1955, the son of Prince Talal bin Abdulaziz, himself a significant figure in Saudi political history, a prince who had advocated in the early 1960s for constitutional reform and had briefly gone into self-imposed exile in Egypt, in solidarity with the Nasserist Arab nationalism movement before reconciling with his family. Al-Walid grew up in the specific circumstances of a mid-ranking prince, wealthy by any normal standard, connected to the royal family's highest levels, but not in the innermost circle of power, not one of the sons of the key Abdulaziz branches, whose proximity to the throne translated most directly into institutional authority. He left Saudi Arabia to study in the United States, Menlo College in California, then Syracuse University, where he earned a master's degree in social science. He returned to Riyadh in the early 1980s with a business degree and a set of ideas about how to operate in the Saudi economy that were, in certain respects, genuinely different from the approach his peers were taking. He wanted to build something real, not merely to extract wealth from access, though he did that too, but to build business organizations that had genuine commercial logic, that could generate returns on the basis of their own operations rather than purely on the basis of their political relationships. He started with real estate. He borrowed money, a lot of money by the standards of a young prince just starting out, and used it to buy properties in Riyadh that he believed were undervalued. He was right. The Riyadh property market in the early 1980s was, for a man who understood it and had the capital to move, an extraordinary opportunity. He made money. He made more money. He reinvested it with the speed and an aggression that his conservative Saudi peers found slightly alarming. Then he turned to the stock market. The Saudi Stock Exchange, the Tadawul, was in the early 1980s a relatively unsophisticated market, dominated by a small number of large companies and characterized by the kind of information asymmetry and insider dynamics that made it, for someone with good connections and good judgment, very profitable. Al-Walid built positions. He took stakes in Saudi banks and industrial companies and then, increasingly, in international companies that he believed were undervalued. The international investments are what made him globally famous. In 1991, Citicorp, the American banking giant predecessor of today's Citigroup, was in serious trouble. The savings and loan crisis had damaged the entire banking sector, and Citicorp's specific problems, including a large exposure to troubled real estate loans, had driven its stock from nearly $40 to about $10. The company needed capital. It was not a popular moment to be asking Wall Street for money. Al-Walid invested $600 million. He took a significant stake in a major American bank at the moment of maximum pessimism, when the institutional wisdom was that the banking sector was broken and the recovery timeline was uncertain. He did this with a combination of genuine analytical conviction. He believed Citicorp's core business was sound and the stock price reflected temporary panic rather than permanent impairment, and the specific boldness of a man who was operating outside the consensus and had access to capital that did not require the approval of an institutional investment committee. Citicorp recovered. His 600 million became, over the following years, several billion dollars. And Al-Walid became, almost overnight, a figure of international financial credibility. Not just a Saudi prince with oil money, but a serious investor whose judgment had been tested against real markets and found to be good. He bought stakes in Apple when Steve Jobs had just returned and the company was still fighting for survival. He owned 4% of Apple before the iPod, before the iPhone, before any of the products that made Apple the most valuable company in the world. He invested in Twitter at a stage when Twitter was still a loss-making startup and the social media model was still being dismissed by significant sections of the investment community as fundamentally unmonetizable. He bought the Savoy Hotel in London. He built the Al-Walid Philanthropies Foundation, contributing to education and health programs on a scale that genuine philanthropy requires. He acquired a tower in Paris. He owned significant stakes in media companies, hotel chains, and technology firms across 20 countries. By the mid-2000s, his estimated net worth ranged between $15 and $30 billion. The uncertainty itself a reflection of the opacity of Saudi wealth, the difficulty of independently verifying stakes in private companies, and the genuine complexity of a portfolio built across dozens of jurisdictions without the disclosure requirements of publicly listed holdings. Forbes and Bloomberg published estimates. Al-Walid disputed them. The disputes became a recurring feature of the financial press's coverage of him. A semi-comic performance in which the world's most famous Saudi investor argued, with theatrical insistence, that he was richer than anyone was willing to say. He was certainly rich enough to build, in 2008, the Fairmont Mecca Hotel, a skyscraper adjacent to the Grand Mosque in Mecca, visible from the mosque's prayer areas, which attracted both significant commercial success and significant religious controversy. He was rich enough to commission a super yacht called the Kingdom 5 KR, 320 feet long, designed by John Bannenberg, one of the most famous yacht designers in the world, with a price tag that variously estimated reports placed between $100 million and $200 million. He was rich enough to own, at various points, a Boeing 747 customized to his personal specifications, a flying palace with a conference room and a bedroom suite, and a lounge and all the other amenities that the phrase private jet does not quite capture when the jet in question is the same size as the planes airlines use for transatlantic routes. He was also, on the morning of November 4, 2017, one of the men brought to the Ritz-Carlton. Al-Walid's detention was, perhaps more than any other arrest in that extraordinary sweep, the signal to the outside world that MBS was operating without constraints. Because if they were willing to arrest Al-Walid, a man with a direct phone line to half the CEOs of the Fortune 500, a man whose face had been on the cover of Time magazine, a man whose international profile and international connections meant that his detention would be noticed and commented on from London to Washington to Tokyo, then there was no one in Saudi Arabia who was safe. He was held for 83 days. He emerged in January 2018, walking out of the Ritz-Carlton in the same suit he had walked in wearing, because that was the thing he chose to communicate with his departure: dignity and the appearance of choice, even in circumstances where choice had been comprehensively removed. He gave an interview to Reuters from inside the hotel, in which he said the investigation was proceeding well, and that he expected to be cleared of all allegations. He said he supported MBS and the anti-corruption drive. He said everything that a man in his position, in his society, in his specific circumstances, was going to say. The amount he paid for his freedom was never officially disclosed. Reports range from hundreds of millions to several billion dollars. What was disclosed, eventually, was that Al-Walid retained a significant portion of his fortune, that the deal struck in the Ritz-Carlton had not wiped him out, had not destroyed his business empire, had not reduced him to ordinary circumstances. He was still a billionaire. He was, quite specifically, a billionaire who had recently been reminded that his billions existed at the pleasure of the state, and that the pleasure of the state was no longer unconditional. But Al-Walid is, in many ways, the Saudi billionaire story that the outside world knows. He is visible. He gives interviews. He posts on social media. He appears at Davos. He is, by the specific definition of the term, a public figure. The far more interesting story, The story that the opacity of the Saudi system protects most jealously, the story that requires the most excavation to tell, is the story of the wealth that is not visible. The fortunes that do not appear in Forbes rankings, and do not attend Davos, and do not give interviews, and do not, in any conventional sense, have a public existence at all. The money that moves through shell companies in the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg and the British Virgin Islands. The real estate portfolios that are registered in names that don't appear in the Saudi royal family genealogy, but that are connected to specific princes through networks of nominees and trusted intermediaries. The bank accounts in Geneva and Zurich and London and New York that are the final resting places of wealth extracted from the Saudi state over decades through mechanisms that the Saudi legal system would classify as corruption, but that the social system accepted as normal. This money is estimated by economists who study Gulf wealth flows, by compliance officers at the international banks that handle some of it, by intelligence analysts whose job it is to track the movement of sovereign wealth, to be enormous. The specific number is unknowable because the design of the system is precisely to make it unknowable. But the signals are everywhere if you know how to read them. London real estate is one of the most legible signals. Walk through Mayfair and Knightsbridge and Belgravia, the most expensive residential districts in the most expensive real estate market in Europe, and count the dark windows. The apartments where the lights never come on, where the cleaners come every week, but the owners come every year, where the value stored in the walls of the building is not the value of a home, but the value of an asset parked beyond the jurisdiction of any authority that might one day ask where it came from. A significant proportion of the most expensive residential property in central London is owned by Gulf Arab families, and a significant proportion of that proportion is owned by Saudis. The sums involved are, in aggregate, extraordinary. Billion-dollar neighborhoods of dark windows, each one a specific conversation about wealth and safety and the wisdom of keeping money in a jurisdiction with the rule of law, far from the place where it was earned. The London real estate is the visible end of something that extends much further and goes much deeper. Saudi money is in the French Riviera, in the great villas along the Cap d'Antibes coast that the French real estate market privately acknowledges are owned by Gulf interests through French shell companies. It is in Switzerland, in the Geneva private banks that have been managing the discrete wealth of the world's most opaque elites for 2 centuries, and that were, for several decades, the preferred repository of Saudi money that could not easily be explained or legitimated. It is in the United States, in New York apartments, in California land, in private equity funds and hedge funds and other investment vehicles that accept large sums from foreign limited partners without requiring those partners to appear on any public register. The structure of this wealth, the specific organizational architecture through which it is held and moved and protected, is one of the more elaborate constructions in the history of private finance. A Saudi prince with serious money does not typically hold it in his own name in an account at a Saudi bank. The money has usually passed through at least several layers of intermediaries before it reaches a form in which it can be accessed and used. It might start as a commission on a defense contract, paid to a company registered in a Gulf-free zone under a name that is not the prince's, but that is controlled by a nominee who is himself controlled by a trust structure based in the Channel Islands, which distributes income to a foundation in Liechtenstein, which lends money to a private company in Luxembourg, which owns an apartment building in Paris, which generates rental income that is available to the prince through a consulting agreement with a company in Dubai. This is not hypothetical. This is, with variations in the specific jurisdictions and instruments, the standard operating architecture of serious Gulf wealth management, developed and refined over decades by the international law firms and the private banks and the offshore financial centers that have built entire industries around the specific need of wealthy people in politically uncertain environments to hold their money beyond the reach of any single government. The opacity is the product, not the byproduct. People pay substantial fees to lawyers, to banks, to nominees, to the offshore centers themselves for the specific service of invisibility. The Saudi princes who built these structures were not, in most cases, stupid. They were responding to a rational incentive. The Saudi state had shown throughout its history that proximity to power was the source of wealth, and that the loss of proximity, through death of a patron, through political misfortune, through the kind of succession dispute that a monarchy with dozens of potential heirs generates inevitably, could mean the loss of wealth with a speed that no contractual protection could prevent. Money kept in Saudi Arabia, in Saudi banks, in Saudi assets, was money that the state could reach. Money moved offshore, structured invisibly, held in jurisdictions with strong property rights and strong banking secrecy, was money that was safer, not from the moral implications of its origins, but from the practical risk of political reversal. The Ritz-Carlton episode was, in this sense, the ultimate confirmation of the risk they had been trying to protect against. The men who had most thoroughly internationalized their wealth, who had the most money offshore, the most assets in jurisdictions beyond MBS's reach, were in the best position in November 2017. The men who had kept significant assets in the kingdom, who had been slower to internationalize, or who had been more conspicuously accumulating within the Saudi system, were the most exposed. There is a specific, dark lesson in this. The corruption that drove the internationalization of Saudi wealth was also, ultimately, the best protection against the consequences of that corruption. But let us go beyond the princes, because the Saudi billionaire story is not exclusively a story of royalty. There are families in Saudi Arabia, business families, merchant families, the descendants of the Hijazi traders and the Najdi merchants, and the families who arrived from the Indian subcontinent and the Yemen and East Africa over the centuries of Red Sea commerce, who have built fortunes of enormous scale through commercial activity that was not simply a function of royal patronage, though royal patronage was always part of the picture. The Olayan family, the Bin Laden family, the Al-Raji family, the Jamil family. These are names that mean something in the world of international business, in the specific corridors where serious money is managed and serious commercial decisions are made, even if they are less familiar to the general public than, say, a Saudi prince with a Twitter account and a publicly visible superyacht. The Olayan Group, founded by the late Suleiman Olayan, is one of the great success stories of Saudi commercial history. Olayan started working as a truck driver for Aramco in the late 1940s. He built from that starting point a business empire that eventually stretched across construction, food, finance, and industrial products, with partnerships with some of the largest international companies in the world, Mobil Oil, Colgate-Palmolive, Eaton Corporation, that brought international best practices into the Saudi market while giving Olayan Group the credibility and the technical support to compete effectively. By the time of his death in 2002, the Olayan Group was estimated to be worth several $billion, managed with a professionalism and a discipline that distinguished it from many of the purely relationship-driven Saudi enterprises of the same era. His daughter Lubna Olayan became, in her own right, one of the most significant figures in Saudi business, the first woman to address a major Saudi economic conference, one of the first women on the board of a Saudi company, a figure whose public prominence represented both the extraordinary possibility and the very real limitations of women's advancement in Saudi commercial life. She managed the Olayan Group's international investment portfolio with a sophistication that earned respect in the most demanding financial markets in the world. The Al-Raji family built its fortune through a different mechanism, through banking and specifically through the development of Islamic banking, the Sharia-compliant financial services model that prohibits the charging of interest and structures financial products around profit-sharing and asset-backed transactions. Al-Raji Bank, which the family founded and built into the largest Islamic bank in the world, is a genuinely impressive commercial achievement, a business that responded to a real demand, executed at scale, and built a customer base that extends across the Islamic world. The family's wealth, estimated in multiple billions of dollars, is among the most legitimate in origin of any Saudi fortune at this scale, built from a genuine business serving genuine customers rather than from the commission structures and contract margins that define many Saudi fortunes. The Bin Laden Group, Saudi Bin Laden Group, formally, is, by its own account, the largest construction company in the world, and certainly one of the largest engineering firms operating in the Middle East. The family built their position initially through the specific opportunity that no other company had: the construction and expansion of the sacred mosques in Mecca and Medina. The Grand Mosque in Mecca and the Prophet's Mosque in Medina are, by any measure, the most significant construction projects in the Islamic world, expanded repeatedly over the decades as the growing global Muslim population and the growing ease of international travel sent the number of pilgrims to unprecedented levels. The contracts for this work, awarded to the bin Laden family through a relationship with the Al Saud that went back to King Abdulaziz himself, generated revenues that funded the growth of a construction empire that eventually built airports, highways, government buildings, and commercial developments across Saudi Arabia and the wider Gulf. The family became globally known in a way they deeply did not want. When one of the 50-plus sons of the family patriarch, Mohammed bin Laden, became the most wanted man in the world on September 12, 2001. The family's disavowal of Osama was immediate and genuine. The specific horror of a business dynasty whose entire existence was built on a relationship with the Saudi state finding itself publicly associated with the man who had just attacked the United States. The bin Laden family was not responsible for Osama bin Laden in any meaningful sense. Families do not choose all their members, and the bin Laden group's commercial operations bore no relationship whatsoever to the ideological enterprise that Osama had been constructing since the Afghan War of the 1980s. But the association was damaging, and managing the damage required a combination of public positioning and private relationship management that occupied significant senior attention in the family's leadership for years. The company survived, it is still operating, it is still building, but it operates today in the shadow of a name association that no commercial performance can fully dissolve. The lifestyle that the very top of Saudi wealth sustains is, by any normal measure, staggering. Not in the vulgar sense of conspicuous consumption, though conspicuous consumption is certainly present, but in the sheer scale of the physical infrastructure that serious Saudi wealth deploys. The palaces. There are palaces in Riyadh that are not buildings in any ordinary sense. They are compounds, walled cities of multiple structures covering hundreds of acres, with their own power plants and water treatment facilities and staff quarters and security infrastructure, built to the aesthetic specifications of men who grew up in a culture that regarded the expression of wealth through architecture as both a social obligation and a religious statement. The quality of the construction varies. Some Saudi palaces are extraordinary achievements of architectural ambition. Others are monuments to the specific taste that results when unlimited money meets limited exposure to the world's best design traditions. But the scale is consistent. The scale is always extraordinary. The aviation. Saudi billionaires own aircraft at a density that has no parallel anywhere in the world except possibly the UAE. Not merely private jets, business jets of the kind that every serious billionaire keeps. They own converted wide-body airliners, Boeing 747s and 777s and Airbus A380s, the largest aircraft in the world, fitted out as personal transports with bedrooms and conference rooms and chapels and stabling areas for horses and all the other specific requirements that a family of significant size and significant religious observance and significant attachment to its horses has when it travels internationally. Saudi Arabia is, by some estimates, the single largest market for converted airliner private jets in the world. The fleet of the Al Waleed Philanthropies alone was, at its peak, enough to populate a small regional airline. The horses. This is a thread in the Saudi wealth story that Western observers consistently underestimate. The Arabian horse has been the central status animal of Arabian culture for 1,000 years. And among the wealthiest Saudi families, the relationship to Arabian horse breeding and racing is not a hobby or a pastime. It is a passion of the same depth and the same consuming intensity that motor racing represented for Enzo Ferrari, or that art collecting represented for J.P. Morgan. Saudi princes own studs in England and Ireland and France and Kentucky, the world's great thoroughbred breeding centers. The top Saudi owners are among the biggest spenders at the major annual horse auctions, at Tattersall's in Newmarket, at Keeneland and Lexington, at the sales in Deauville, where they compete with the best resourced buyers in the world for the most promising bloodstock. The money spent on horses by the wealthiest Saudi families is not trivial. It runs, in total, into billions of dollars. The yachts, the super yachts, the mega yachts. The Gulf has, over the past 4 decades, produced a market for extraordinary private vessels that has driven the yacht-building industry of Northern Europe to its current scale. Dutch and German and Italian shipyards have grown, in significant part, on the strength of orders from Gulf-era clients. The vessels they build, some of them over 400 feet long, some of them equipped with submarines and swimming pools and helicopter landing pads and movie theaters and gyms and dining rooms that seat 40 and engineering systems of a complexity that rivals naval vessels. These are the physical expression of a specific wealth aesthetic that values privacy, mobility, and the ability to exist in complete self-sufficiency beyond the territorial jurisdiction of any single nation. The privacy dimension matters. A very large yacht, anchored in international waters, is one of the most genuinely private environments available to a wealthy person. You can have conversations that no government can surveil. You can host guests that no embassy can track. You can move between countries in ways that generate diplomatic rather than immigration records. For men whose wealth had complex origins and whose political circumstances required regular management of information, the yacht was not merely a luxury, it was infrastructure. The same logic applied to the private aircraft. A Saudi prince traveling on his own Boeing 747 was not submitting to the searches and scanners and documentation requirements of commercial aviation. He was moving in a private environment, in a vehicle that was legally Saudi territory for the duration of the flight, carrying whatever and whoever he chose to carry without the intervention of any customs or border authority that had the practical ability to inspect the cargo. This is not a theoretical observation about diplomatic privilege. It is a description of how the world actually operated for the wealthiest Saudi travelers for several decades, until, gradually, under the combined pressure of post-September 11 security requirements and the expanding reach of anti-money laundering regulations, the practical immunity of private aircraft travel began to be qualified in meaningful ways. The spending in London and Paris and Geneva and New York and the Maldives and St. Bart's and all the other places where Saudi wealth was regularly deployed, operated according to an internal logic that most outside observers never quite grasped. It was not random. It was not simply the behavior of men with too much money and too little discipline. It was a specific economic and social system in which wealth had to be visibly deployed to maintain the relationships and the status that made the wealth available in the first place. A Saudi prince who was seen to be flying on commercial airlines and staying in regular hotels was communicating something about his current position in the hierarchy that would be immediately read and acted upon by the people around him. Visible wealth was not optional. It was signal. It told the people who needed to know that this man's position was secure, that the relationships were intact, that doing business with him remained worthwhile. The shopping. European luxury brands discovered the Saudi market in the 1970s, and it remains, 50 years later, one of the most important markets on earth for everything from haute couture to jewelry to watches to furniture to the interior design services that specify and install all of the above. Harrods in London maintains, and has maintained for decades, a Saudi relations team staff who speak Arabic, who understand the specific requirements and preferences of Saudi customers, who facilitate the kind of private shopping appointments and bulk purchases that serious Saudi spenders require. The same is true of the major European jewelers, the major Swiss watch brands, and the Paris couture houses. The Saudi customer, and here the term encompasses not just the billionaires themselves, but the wider network of their families and associates, is, in absolute spending terms, among the most valuable customer groups in the global luxury market. The specific requirements of Saudi shopping in Europe reflect both wealth and the specific social circumstances of Saudi Arabia. Saudi women who wore full abaya and niqab at home, who observed the strictest interpretation of religious dress requirements in the kingdom, who might not leave the house without a male guardian, were in London and Paris and Milan, something entirely different. The private shopping appointments, the hotel suites stocked with merchandise for review, the boutiques that would close their public floors for 2 hours on a Thursday afternoon for a Saudi family visiting. These arrangements reflected not hypocrisy but the genuine complexity of people who inhabited two worlds simultaneously and who found in the spaces between those worlds a freedom that neither world alone provided. Not all of it was private. Not all of it was invisible. Saudi Arabia's wealthiest created, across the globe, a footprint that was genuinely visible to anyone who cared to look. The offices of the major Saudi investment funds in London and New York and Singapore. The endowments and donations to Western universities, Harvard, MIT, Oxford, LSE, Georgetown, that established chairs and funded research centers and built buildings that carried Saudi names or were funded by Saudi money. The political donations, the lobbying organizations, the think tanks, and the public relations firms hired to manage the reputation of Saudi Arabia and the Saudi government in Western capitals. The sports investments, golf tournaments and tennis tournaments and Formula One races, and, most recently and most expansively, the acquisition of football clubs and golf tours and boxing championships that represented an entirely new phase of Saudi public strategy, using sport as the mechanism for inserting Saudi interests and Saudi visibility into the daily consciousness of Western audiences. The decision to acquire Newcastle United Football Club in 2021 through a Saudi state-backed consortium was not primarily a football decision. It was a branding decision, an image management decision, a calculated investment in the specific emotional infrastructure of a sport with 3 billion global followers, in which club ownership confers a degree of emotional legitimacy and public affinity that no amount of advertising or diplomatic activity can purchase. Saudi Arabia understood this. The Saudi Public Investment Fund, the sovereign wealth fund that MBS was using as the primary vehicle for his economic diversification strategy, Vision 2030, understood this. The opponents of the deal understood this too, and their objections, focused on the human rights record of the Saudi state, were objections precisely to the mechanism being used, the buying of the emotional loyalty of ordinary people as a means of softening the political criticism of extraordinary ones. The LIV Golf Project, the breakaway tour that the PIF funded, attracting the world's biggest names in professional golf with appearance fees that the traditional tour structures simply could not match, was the same strategy deployed in a different sport. The sums required were significant, but the sums available to the PIF were essentially unlimited, and the calculation was straightforward. Spend a relatively small fraction of the fund's resources to acquire a level of global sports visibility that would take generations and much larger sums to achieve through any other mechanism. These investments are not, strictly speaking, the secretive life of Saudi billionaires. They are very public. They are designed to be public. But they are the public face of a wealth ecosystem, whose interior remains extraordinarily well protected, and understanding the public face helps you understand what the private life is protecting and why. What is being protected, ultimately, is the relationship between the Al Saud dynasty and the wealth of Saudi Arabia, the relationship that has existed since 1938, in which the state's petroleum revenues have been simultaneously the source of national development and the foundation of private enrichment at a scale that no democratic society would tolerate, and that the Saudi system has been able to sustain because it is not, in any conventional sense, a democratic society. MBS understands this relationship better than anyone, and his understanding of it is genuinely different from his predecessors. He is not trying to eliminate the relationship between state power and personal wealth. That would be to eliminate the foundation of the entire system. He is trying to reorganize it, to concentrate it, to ensure that the wealth flowing from Saudi petroleum revenues flows primarily to the priorities he has decided are important. Vision 2030. The diversification of the economy away from oil dependency, the technology investments and the entertainment investments and the tourism investments and the sports investments that are all components of the project to remake Saudi Arabia in ways that serve its long-term interests as he understands them. The men who were arrested in the Ritz-Carlton were not, for the most part, innocent people who had been wrongly accused. They had accumulated wealth through mechanisms that were, by any reasonable standard, corrupt mechanisms that diverted public resources to private accounts, that awarded contracts on the basis of personal relationships rather than merit, that enriched individuals at the expense of the national treasury. This was true. The anti-corruption framing of the arrests was not entirely dishonest. But it was also true that MBS himself and the specific inner circle that surrounded him as he consolidated power were using the same mechanisms of state access and proximity to power to build their own wealth and their own commercial empire. The difference was not moral. The difference was political. The old network was being replaced by a new network. The old access was being replaced by new access. The corruption was being reorganized, not eliminated. The world's most exclusive hotel had been turned into a prison to enforce this reorganization. The men who left it, richer than almost anyone alive, poorer than they had walked in, understood exactly what had happened and exactly what it meant. Power in Saudi Arabia had always been the source of wealth. Power in Saudi Arabia had changed hands, and the wealth, in the long run, follows the power. It always has. In the palaces and the compounds and the yachts and the dark London apartments and the Geneva bank accounts and the Riyadh hotel that was briefly, extraordinarily, a prison. The wealth follows the power. In Saudi Arabia, it always will. The money, the hundreds of billions of petrodollars, the commissions and the contracts and the margins and the allocations, all of it spiraling outward from the wells of the Eastern Province, through the royal court, and the investment funds and the business empires and the family fortunes and the offshore structures, and the offshore structures, and the offshore structures, and the offshore structures, and the unreal estate and the Parisian shopping and the Swiss banking and the international sports investments. All of it is, in the end, the product of a single transaction. A deal struck in 1938 between a desert king and an American oil company, in a territory that had no electricity and no paved roads and no running water and no telephone and nothing, apparently, to offer the world except its faith and its camels. Except for what was underneath. Everything else followed from there. Every palace, every jet, every superyacht, every dark window in Mayfair, every gold-plated hotel room turned prison cell. Every prince who walked out of the Ritz-Carlton in January 2018, a little poorer and considerably more frightened, back into a world that was now organized according to rules he had not been consulted about and could not change. The oil is running out, not tomorrow, not next decade. But the trajectory is clear, and the Saudis know it clearer than anyone, and the knowledge of it drives everything that MBS is doing with the Sovereign Wealth Fund and the sports investments and the entertainment economy and Vision 2030. The age of petroleum is ending, slowly and then quickly, and when it ends, the specific mechanism that produced Saudi billionaires at this scale and this speed will be gone. What will remain is the wealth already accumulated, distributed through its 1,000 offshore structures and its Mayfair apartments and its Swiss accounts, managed by the lawyers and the bankers and the nominees who have made the business of Saudi wealth management one of the most profitable niches in the global financial industry for 50 years. And what will remain, too, is the fundamental reality that made all of it possible, the fact that in a very small part of the world, the Earth happens to be saturated in a specific kind of ancient organic material that the modern industrial economy converted for approximately 100 years into the most valuable substance on the planet. They were born in the right place at the right time. That, in the end, is the whole story. Everything else is just details,